By the time Archdeacon Lucien died, leaving the Bonaparte family comfortably off, Napoleon's ambitions had moved on a notch. With Joseph already president of the Ajaccio Directory, the Bonapartes were making progress. Fortified by the gold of the late miser Lucien, Letizia, still a striking woman habitually dressed in black, was able to abandon her chores as housekeeper and start spending money on home and children. The family dynamic was beginning to grow complicated. At 16, Lucien was a spoiled neurotic who resented the eminence of his two older brothers. 13-year-old Louis, whom Napoleon was glad to be able to offload, was a good-looking mother's boy and favorite with women but something of a hop out of kin. 7-year-old Jérôme was apparently as tiresome as a child as he was to be ineffective, and useless as an adult. With Elissa, aged 14, absent at St. Cyr, and the pale-skinned 9-year-old Caroline, a quiet child with some musical talent, Pauline, aged 11, was already usurping the role of most striking female Bonaparte. Emotional, charming, humorous, and showing signs of her later stunning beauty, Pauline seemed to have inherited Letizia's looks and Carlo's love of pleasure. To advance in Corsican politics meant making a minute analysis of the power structure on the island, something Napoleon, with his love of detail, was good at. On the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, Corsica had at first been bedeviled by the extreme factionalism between the royalists led by Buttafuoco and Peretti, who relied for support on the army, and the Paolists, whose power came from strong popular support. Throughout 1790 and 1791, the Paolists had won victory after victory, culminating in the royalist defeat when they tried to prevent the two Paolist representatives, Gentile and Pozzo di Borgo, taking their seats at the National Assembly. But almost immediately after this decisive rout of the royalists, the Paolistas had themselves begun to splinter, basically between those loyal to France and revolutionary principles, and those who distrusted the revolution's anticlericalism and its attitude to property and hankered after an independent and separate Corsica. Paoli, at first the champion of the revolution against the old regime, increasingly emerged as a conservative figure, moving back into reaction even as many of his followers swung left into Jacobinism. The vociferous nature of the Paolist movement resulted in violent religious riots in Bastia in June 1791. There was bloodshed, Bastia lost the rank of capital city, and, more ominously, Paoli's authority and prestige were compromised, and a parliamentary opposition arose against him. Napoleon in late 1791 still retained his faith in Paoli. His strategy now was to parlay his furlough into a quasi-permanent leave while becoming an adjutant major in a volunteer company. This would make him a significant military force in the land. But in December 1791, the National Assembly came close to torpedoing this strategy with a law requiring all officers in the regular army to return to their regiments for a nationwide census, to be carried out between the 25th of December and the 10th of January 1792. Fortunately for Napoleon, the deputy military commander in Corsica, General Antonio Rossi, had already petitioned Minister of War Narbonne for Napoleon's commission in the Ajaccio Volunteer Regiment, and a favorable reply to the request arrived in January 179. Rossi wrote to Colonel Campagnol of the 4th Regiment to inform him that First Lieutenant Bonaparte was now an adjutant major in the Corsican Volunteers. But Napoleon's problems were not yet over, for in February 1792 the National Assembly passed a further law, requiring all officers of volunteer battalions to rejoin their regular army regiments by the end of March. The only exception permitted was to the handful of colonels of important volunteer battalions. There were only 2 such lieutenant colonelships in Corsica, and it was now Napoleon's task to obtain one of them or see his career as a Corsican political fixer in ruins. The 2 colonelships were elective positions, in which the 500 or so National Guardsmen cast 2 votes for their 2 chosen candidates, in order of preference. Napoleon began by getting Paoli's backing for himself and Q. Inza as the 2 lieutenant colonels. They faced stiff opposition, particularly from Jean Peraldi and Pozzo di Borgo, scion of another of Ajaccio's great families. Napoleon began by laying out a good part of Archdeacon Lucien's legacy on bribery. More than 200 voting volunteers were lodged free of charge in the grounds of the Casa Buonaparte, and provided with lavish board for the 2 weeks before the elections. Then Napoleon thought of other ways to scupper the opposition. Tradition says that he actually tried to eliminate Pozzo di Borgo physically, by challenging him to a duel which Pozzo did not accept. What is certain is that Napoleon added intimidation to the bribery he had already employed. 3 commissioners had been appointed to supervise the election. One of them, Moratti by name, made the mistake of choosing to lodge the night before the vote at the house of the Peraldis, well known as opponents of the Bonapartes and supporters of Pozzo. Napoleon's men simply arrived at the Paraldi house at dinner time and abducted Moratti to ensure his impartiality. Next day, the election took place in the Church of San Francesco. 521 volunteers arrived to record their preferences, but Pozzo di Borgo harangued them on the infamy of the Bonapartes. For his pains he was pulled off the platform and narrowly escaped a knifing. It is said that Pozzo, who had hitherto not been Napoleon's rival, swore eternal vengeance by the code of vendetta. He certainly made good his threat in later years. Then the voting started. Quenzer received the highest number of votes and was elected the first lieutenant colonel. Napoleon, with 422 first and second preferences, was a comfortable second and so found himself, not yet 23, a lieutenant colonel of the Corsican volunteers. Since Quenzer had no military experience, Napoleon was the effective commander and at once evinced his ability to remember every last detail about the personnel and organization of anybody he commanded. Although the royalists on Corsica had been decisively routed in a political sense, they still retained the support of the army in key strongholds. Paoli and the Directory, the centrally directed administration of Corsica, decided that the final stage in taking power in Corsica was to replace these royalist troops with the volunteers, and an obvious first target was the citadel at Ajaccio. General Rossi protested, but was overruled by the Directory, supported by Paoli. In response, the royalists played the clerical card, counting on the monarchist sympathies of most of Ajaccio. The National Assembly had already decreed that monasteries and religious orders were to be dissolved, but in March 1, 792 a town meeting in Ajaccio petitioned that the Capucin order be accepted. The Corsican Directory reiterated the decree and added that the town meeting had no authority, being merely an unlawful assembly. This was the juncture at which Christophe Antoine Salisti, already a delegate to the National Assembly in Paris, and a rising star in the Corsican opposition to Paoli, first appeared in full Machiavellian skill. A tall, sinister-looking man with a pockmarked face, Salisti spread the whisper that Paoli was a fence-sitter who had secret sympathies with the royalist rump in Ajaccio, and urged Napoleon to settle scores once and for all with the diehards in that town. Accordingly, Napoleon entered the town with 4 companies of Republican volunteers, in full knowledge of the hatred that existed between the pious, royalist townspeople and his rural guardsmen. On Easter Sunday, the 8th of April 1792, a group of priests, who had refused to swear an oath of primary loyalty to the French Republic, held a service in the officially dissolved convent of St. Francis, and announced a religious procession, actually a political demonstration under another name, for the following day. At 5 p.m. Napoleon, hearing of disturbances around the cathedral, took a platoon of his men to investigate. Outside the cathedral he found a hostile mob who, it transpired, had already disarmed another platoon of volunteers and taken their muskets. When Napoleon heard of this, he demanded the weapons back and an angry altercation ensued. Suddenly a shot rang out and Lieutenant Rocca della Sera of the volunteers fell dead. Napoleon and his men rushed for cover, then made their way back to their headquarters by back streets. It did not take a man of any great military talent, let alone Napoleon's superlative gifts, to work out that the key to the control of Ajaccio lay in command of the citadel. The snag was that this stronghold was held by a Colonel Maillard, commanding 400 men of the 42nd Infantry Regiment, and both commander and troops were loyal to Louis XVI. Napoleon went to see Maillard, who predictably proved uncooperative. Napoleon's argument was that his men were in mortal danger from angry townspeople, and needed to take refuge in the citadel or at the very least to have access to the ammunition there. Maillard not only refused to accept either of these points but ordered Cuenza and Napoleon to withdraw their volunteers from the town center to the convent of St. Francis. Napoleon responded by getting from his friend, the procureur syndic of the district, an order overruling any orders issued by Maillard or the municipality. The procureur did so, adding the writer that Maillard was duty-bound to protect the volunteers. Maillard, however, was adamant that he would accept only the orders of the municipality. Despite the version of those who try to present Napoleon as a Machiavellian bully in this incident, it is quite clear that he had the law on his side. Napoleon and Quenzer refused to withdraw but offered a compromise. If Maillard withdrew his proviso about the volunteers retreating to the convent of St. Francis, they for their part would show goodwill by sending home the particular individuals in the National Guard most objected to by the townspeople. Maillard grudgingly accepted this, but Napoleon followed up the offer by surreptitiously extending his control in the town. The armed royalists in the town and the volunteers now began fortifying the houses they occupied, ready for a bout of grim street fighting, while Napoleon unsuccessfully tried to suborn the troops in the citadel to rebel. To twist the knife still further, He instituted a food blockade by the Republican peasantry. Napoleon's men killed cattle, ravaged orchards, and cut off water supplies. The conflict escalated when the municipality got Maillard to wheel out cannon from the citadel, preparatory to expelling the volunteers by force. Napoleon then produced a letter from the Directory authorizing him to stand fast and, if necessary, bring in more volunteers. It was quite clear that the municipality was putting itself in a position where it was defying the elected government of Corsica, and thus making itself legally responsible for all damage sustained in the expected fighting. Evidently, the hotheads in Ajaccio finally perceived they were getting into very deep water. They backed down and agreed to compromise peace with Napoleon. Maillard, however, refused to be party even to this, claiming to be upholding the law. Since both the Directory and the municipality were now in agreement, it is difficult to see what this law could be. In his own mind, it involved the supremacy of the claims of Louis XVI, as interpreted by him, against those of the French Republic, but in strictly legal terms his action was treason. Historical precedents were all against him, for the legitimacy of the House of Stuart in England had not prevented the execution of Charles I or, in the following century, dozens of Jacobites. Eventually 2 commissioners arrived from the Directory to sort out the fracas. They arrested some of the troublemaking members of the municipality, but the defiant Maillard simply retired to the citadel and challenged Paoli and the Directory to blast him out. Napoleon, Quenza and the volunteers had won the moral victory, and Napoleon had shown himself to be exceptionally intrepid, energetic and resourceful, but the affair left a nasty taste in Ajaccio. Henceforth his reputation there plummeted, and Pozzo di Borgo was able to make significant propaganda ground in his vendetta. When peace was made, Napoleon went to court, where he had an interview with Paoli, but his mind was on France, where his position with his regiment was precarious. At the review held on January 1, 792, the regimental record stated, Bonaparte, first lieutenant, whose permission of absence has expired, is in Corsica. He was expressly left out of the list of those recommended to the National Assembly as having legitimate reasons for absence. It was evident that to clear his name Napoleon would have to go to Paris, for he was now virtually regarded as an emigre, as appears from the following note placed against his name in a list of lieutenants at the Ministry of War: has given up his profession, and has been replaced on February 6, 1792. Sometime early in May 1, 792, Napoleon left Corsica on his urgent mission to Paris. He reached the French capital on the 28th of May, to find that war had broken out with Prussia and France had sustained its first defeats. He wrote to Joseph that the capital was in a tense state, with financial chaos and the assignat at half its old value. It seemed to be a season for meeting old acquaintances, not all of them pleasant, for when Napoleon booked in at the Hotel des Patriotes Hollandaise in the Rue Royale, he found his old enemies Pozzo di Borgo and Paraldi staying there. Next day he bumped into a different sort of acquaintance, for he went to a session of the Assembly and met Bourrienne. For once Bourrienne's memoirs, noting the event, are probably trustworthy. Our friendship dating back to childhood in college was completely revived. Adversity weighed him down and he was often short of money. We spent our time like 2 young people of 23 who have nothing to do and not much money. He was even harder up than I was. Each day we thought up new plans. We were trying to make some profitable speculations. Once he wanted us to rent several houses which were being built in the Rue Montholon in order to sublet them immediately. We found the demands of the landlords exorbitant. Everything failed. On the 16th of June he went to St. Cyr to visit his sister, who asked him to get her out of the convent as soon as legislation promised by the revolutionary government made this possible. On the 20th of June he had arranged to dine with Bourrienne in the Rue Saint-Honor, near the Palais Royal, but, seeing an angry crowd, some as 6,000 strong, debouch from the direction of Les Halles and head towards the river, the 2 young men decided to follow. 2 huge crowds organized by Antoine Santerre headed for the Tuileries. After browbeating the legislature, the crowd, chanting the revolutionary song, Aira pressed on into the undefended palace grounds themselves. In the Salon de l'Oeil de Boeuf they came upon Louis XVI himself, with just a handful of attendants. For the whole of that afternoon the monarch was systematically humiliated, unable to escape, forced to listen to the taunts and abuse of the crowd. Finally, he put on a red hat, the crowning with thorns, and was forced to drink the health of the people of Paris. It was well past 6 o'clock before Jérôme Pétion, the representative of the Assembly, persuaded the now placated multitude to leave. This was a much greater affront to the monarchy even than the return to Paris after the abortive flight to Varennes, and few observers doubted that it was the beginning of the end for Louis XVI. Napoleon, however, thought that if he had been king it would have been an easy matter to disperse the crowd. All this time Napoleon had been submitting documents and affidavits to the Ministry of War, trying to prove his version of events against the hostile counter-testimony of Paraldi. On the 1st of June a departmental committee of the artillery accepted that Napoleon's reasons for not returning from Corsica by April were entirely satisfactory. The committee rejected the Paraldi submission, which has been endorsed by some modern critics of Napoleon, that to accept Napoleon's version was to reward crime. It was preposterous, on this view, that a man who had been leading a riot against the king's army in Corsica should be commended for it, and even secure the promotion he would have got normally only by being with his regular army regiment. Whether Napoleon was a master manipulator, or just lucky, or whether he convinced the committee that he was a true son of the revolution, the result was the same. On July the Ministry of War informed him that he would be reinstated in the 4th Artillery Regiment, with the rank of captain. This new commission was backdated to the 6th of February 1792, which meant Napoleon would receive the equivalent of £4 in back pay. To warn him against further legerdemain, the ministry announced that it expected him to return to his regiment as soon as his promotion was ratified. Meanwhile, some minor complaints brought from Corsica by Peraldi and Pozzo di Borgo would be dealt with by the Ministry of Justice. Napoleon was delighted. He knew, as did his opponents, that the Ministry of Justice was a labyrinth where complaints disappeared. The only thing keeping Napoleon in Paris now was the formal ratification of this decision, in the name of the king, by Minister of War Joseph Servan. Despite his triumph, Napoleon was gloomy. On the 7th of August he wrote to Joseph that the interests of the family necessitated his return to Corsica, but he would probably have to rejoin his regiment. Before that, on the 23rd of July he had written to Lucian words that show the youthful idealism about Corsica giving way to generalized cynicism. Those at the top are poor creatures. It must be admitted, when you see things at first hand, that the people are not worth the trouble taken in winning their favor. You know the history of Ajaccio. That of Paris is exactly the same. Perhaps men are here even a little smaller, nastier, more slanderous and censorious. On August Jean-Paul Marat masterminded the decisive blow against royal power. Of the revolutionaries, Danton, Robespierre, Rossignol and Santerre were all implicated in the day's gory events. Thousands of armed revolutionaries obeyed the tocsin call and converged from right and left banks of the Seine on the Tuileries, defended by ZOOO troops, half of them members of the Swiss Guard. The scenes that followed were among the most terrible in the French Revolution. Confused by contradictory orders, the Swiss Guards were overwhelmed by superior numbers and slaughtered mercilessly. 600 died in the palace courtyard in a hecatomb of stabbing, stoning, clubbing and gunshot. Women stripped the bodies of clothes, and the most savage members of the crowd gelded and mutilated the corpses. When all was over, the dishonored dead were carted away to mass burial in lime pits. Napoleon was an eyewitness of these terrible events, and he later told Joseph that no battlefield carnage ever made such an impression on him. His words to Las Cases on St. Helena are worth quoting. I found myself lodging in Paris, at the Mail in the Place des Victoires. At the sound of the tocsin and on learning that the Tuileries were under attack, I ran to the Carrousel to find Bourrienne's brother, Fauvelet, who kept a furniture shop there. It was from this house that I was able to witness at my ease all the activities of that day. Before reaching the Carrousel I had been met in the Rue de Petits Champs by a group of hideous men bearing a head at the end of a pike. Seeing that I was presentably dressed and had the appearance of a gentleman, they approached me and asked me to shout "Long live the Republic," which you can easily imagine I did without difficulty. With the palace broken into, and the king there, in the heart of the assembly, I ventured to go into the garden. The sight of the dead Swiss guards gave me an idea of the meaning of death such as I have never had since, on any of my battlefields. Perhaps it was that the smallness of the area made the number of corpses appear larger, or perhaps it was because this was the first time I had undergone such an experience. I saw well-dressed women committing acts of the grossest indecency on the corpses of the Swiss guards. Some say his hatred and distrust of the mob dated from that day, and a conviction that only a bourgeois republic could hold in check the forces of anarchy and the dark impulses of the canaille. Napoleon judged that a resolute defense by the king could have saved the Tuileries and that, if he had been in charge, he could have routed the mob. His disdain for the hydra-headed monster of the crowd was increasing daily. If Louis XVI's luck had run out, it was beginning to turn Napoleon's way. A new government decree, on the 17th of August, ordered the dissolution of all religious houses and the confiscation and sale of their assets. Since St. Cyr was no more, Elissa had to leave for Corsica, but the college directors, by now terrified of their own shadows, refused to allow her to leave without two sets of orders, one from the municipality and another from the Versailles Directorate. Napoleon therefore persuaded the local mayor, Aubrin, to go to the college with him. Elissa then made a solemn declaration that she needed her brother to escort her back to Corsica. Aubrin copied this down, then endorsed the copy with his own affidavit that permission was necessary. Napoleon then took the document to Versailles and requested that the Directorate pay traveling expenses. Amazingly, Versailles voted the sum of 352 livres, and authorized him to remove his sister, together with her clothes and linen. Napoleon's trip to Paris therefore ended in total triumph. He had cleared his name, won promotion and back pay, had avoided the necessity to return to his regiment and was now returning to Corsica with all expenses paid. The details of his journey are unknown, but it is probable that he left Paris on the 9th of September, as soon as the war minister had ratified his promotion, took the water coach at Lyons to Valence, then stayed at Marseille for the best part of a month before embarking for Corsica from Toulon on about October, arriving at Ajaccio on 5 October. Once in Corsica, Napoleon proceeded to court to rejoin his volunteer battalion. Shortly after his arrival he had an interview with Paoli, which left both men dissatisfied. Paoli again turned down a Bonaparte request, this time that Lucien be appointed his aide-de-camp. Coming so soon after Joseph's defeat by the partisans of Pozzo di Borgo in recent elections, this was a very clear confirmation of the rumor that Paoli had been won over by the Pozzo di Borgos. For his part, Paoli was animated by a number of considerations. He never cared for the Bonapartes, disliked Joseph, and was merely irritated by the young Napoleon's excessive admiration. Most of all, he thought the entire clan a set of political trimmers and had never forgiven Carlo for his too rapid defection to the French after Q6G. At the ideological level, Napoleon's Jacobinism, contrasting with Paoli's growing disenchantment with revolutionary France, made them unlikely bedfellows. Napoleon came away from the interview injured in his pride and needing time to lick his wounds and take stock. He began to feel that all his scheming to get back to Corsica had been a mistake, that maybe the future did, after all, lie with the 4th Artillery Regiment. Or perhaps he should throw up his career and go to India or somewhere else in the East as a mercenary. Certainly it was a subdued and unwontedly quiet Napoleon who spent the last months of 1792 in court, at least until the 15th of December, when he brought down to Ajaccio 200 men from his battalion for a proposed expedition against Sardinia. Apart from a brief trip back to court, he was in Ajaccio from Christmas 1792 to 8 February 1793, and it was during this limbo period that Lucien remembers his brother often talking to his mother about the opportunities for service in India with Tipu Sahib, Britain's mortal enemy on the subcontinent. By February 1, 793, the French Revolution had taken a dramatic turn.